boys and girls. I'm going to read chapter 14 in The Secret Garden. If you remember, we got more than halfway through chapter 14 last week in school. This was the one where Mary told Martha that she had figured out what the crying was in the corridor, and Martha was not very happy about that. And then Colin requested that Mary come to his bedroom. This is the one called the Young Rajah. So Mary goes to his bedroom and they start talking. They start talking about the moor. And then that's when Mary first challenges the idea that Colin's going to die. So that's where I'm going to start. In my book, I'm about 5 or 6 pages. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pages from the end of the chapter. But I'm going to go back to that part where Mary says, well, have you ever been on the moor? And he says, well, I can't go on the moor. I'm going to die, remember? And then she says, well, how do you know you're going to die? So that's the part I'm going back to. So I'm going to read a little bit, and you see if you can find this spot in the book. In my book, it's page 145, but your book is not going to be the same. So, okay. So she says, you never really see anything if you're ill, said Colin restlessly. Sorry, he says. He looked like a person listening to a new sound in the distance and was wondering what it was. You can't if you stay in a room, said Mary. I couldn't go out on the moor, he said in a resentful tone. Mary was silent for a moment, and then she said something bold. You might, sometimes. He moved as if he were startled. Go on the moor? How could I? I'm going to die. How do you know? Said Mary, unsympathetically. She didn't like the way he had of talking about dying. She did not feel very sympathetic. She felt rather as if he almost boasted about it. Oh, I've heard it ever since I remember, he answered crossly. They were always whispering about it and thinking I didn't notice. They wished I would, too. Mistress Mary felt quite contrary. She pinched her lips together. If they wished I would, she said, I wouldn't. Who wishes you would? The servants, and of course Dr. Craven, because he would get Misselthwaite and be rich instead of poor. He daren't say so, but he always looks cheerful when I'm worse. When I had typhoid fever, his face got quite fat. I think my father wishes it too. I don't believe he does, said Mary quite obstinately. Remember we said obstinately means that she's not giving in. She's going to keep saying it until maybe he starts to believe it. Now, of course, Colin doesn't like it when people are obstinate with him. That made Colin turn and look at her again. Don't you? He said. And then he lay back on his cushion and was still, as if he were thinking. And there was quite a long silence. Perhaps they were both of them thinking strange things children do not usually think of. I like the grand doctor from London, because he made them take the iron thing off, said Mary at last. Did he say you were going to die? No. What did he say? He didn't whisper, Colin answered. Perhaps he knew. I hated whispering. I heard him say one thing quite aloud. He said, the lad might live if he would make up his mind to. Put him in the humor. It sounded as if he were in a temper. I'll tell you who would put you in humor, perhaps, said Mary, reflecting. She felt as if she would like this thing to be settled one way or the other. I believe Dickon would. He's always talking about live things. He never talks about dead things or things that are ill. He's always looking up at the sky to watch birds flying or looking down at the earth to see something growing. He has such round blue eyes, and they're so wide open with looking about. And he laughs such a big laugh with his wide mouth, and his cheeks are as red as cherries. She pulled her stool nearer the sofa, and her expression quite changed at the remembrance of the wide curving mouth and the wide open eyes. See here, she said. Don't let us talk about dying. I don't like it. Let us talk about living. Let us talk and talk about Dickon, and then we will look at your pictures." It was the best thing she could have ever said. To talk about Dickon meant to talk about the moor and about the cottage and the 14 people who lived in it on 16 shillings a week, and the children who got fat on the moor grass like wild ponies, and about Dickon's mother and the skipping rope and the moor with the sun on it, and about pale green points sticking up out of black sod. And it was all so alive that Mary talked more than she had ever talked before. And Colin both talked and listened as he had never done either before. And they both began to laugh over nothings, as children will do when they're happy together. And they laughed so that in the end, they were making as much noise as if they had been two ordinary, healthy, natural 10-year-old creatures, instead of a hard little unloving girl and a sickly boy who believed he was going to die. They enjoyed themselves so much that they forgot the pictures, and they forgot about the time. They had been laughing quite loudly over Ben Weatherstaff and his robin, and Colin was actually sitting up as if he had forgotten about his weak back, when he suddenly remembered something. "Do you know there is one thing we have never once thought of?" he said. "We are cousins." It seemed so queer that they had talked so much and never remembered this simple thing that they laughed more than ever, because they had got into the humor to laugh at anything. And in the midst of the fun, the door opened, and in walked Dr. Craven and Mrs. Medlock. Remember, this is Dr. Craven, not Mr. Craven. Two completely different people. Dr. Craven startled in actual alarm, and Mrs. Medlock almost fell back because he had accidentally bumped against her. "Good Lord!" exclaimed poor Mrs. Medlock, with her eyes almost starting out of her head. "Good Lord!" "What is this?" said Dr. Craven, coming forward. "What does this mean?" Then Mary was reminded of the boy Rajah again. Colin answered as if neither the doctor's alarm nor Mrs. Medlock's terror were of the slightest consequence. He was as little disturbed or frightened as if an elderly cat and dog had walked into the room. "This is my cousin, Mary Lennox," he said. "I asked her to come and talk to me. I like her. She must come back and talk to me whenever I send for her." Dr. Craven turned reproachfully to Mrs. Medlock. "Oh, sir," she panted, I don't know how this happened. There's not a servant on the place that dare to talk. They all have their orders." "Nobody told her anything," said Colin. "She heard me crying and found me herself. I'm glad she came. Don't be silly, Medlock." Mary saw that Dr. Craven did not look pleased, but it was quite plain that he dare not oppose his patient. He sat down by Colin and felt his pulse. "I'm afraid there has been too much excitement. Excitement is not good for you, my boy," he said. "I should be excited if she kept away," answered Colin, his eyes beginning to look dangerously sparkling. "I'm better. She makes me better. The nurse must bring her tea with mine. We will have tea together." Mrs. Medlock and Dr. Craven looked at each other in a troubled way, but there was evidently nothing to be done. "He does look rather better, sir," ventured Mrs. Medlock, but, thinking the matter over, "he looked better this morning before she came into the room." "She came into the room last night. She stayed with me a long time. She sang a Hindustani song to me, and it made me go to sleep," said Colin. "I was better when I wakened up. I wanted my breakfast. I wanted my tea now. Tell nurse, Medlock." Dr. Craven did not stay long. He talked to the nurse for a few minutes when she came into the room and said a few words of warning to Colin. He must not talk too much. He must not forget that he is ill. He must not forget that he is very easily tired. Mary thought there seemed to be a number of uncomfortable things that he was not to forget. Colin looked fretfully and kept his strange, black-lashed eyes fixed on Dr. Craven's face. "I want to forget it," he said at last. "She makes me forget it. This is why I want her." Dr. Craven did not look happy when he left the room. He gave a puzzled glance at the little girl sitting on the large stool. She had become a stiff, silent child again as soon as he entered, and he could not see what the attraction was. The boy actually did look brighter, however, and he sighed rather heavily as he went down the corridor. "They are always wanting me to eat things when I don't want to," said Colin, as the nurse brought in tea and put it on the table. "Now, if you'll eat, I will. Those muffins look nice and hot. Tell me about Rajah's." Okay, so there's the end of 14. And again, instead of the doctor encouraging Colin to feel better and encouraging him to spend time with a friend or a cousin, he's kind of doing the opposite, which was what we talked about how we wonder a little bit about him. We got to learn a little bit more before we can decide what the story is. So now you're going to want to get out your literature binder and go to chapter 14. If you feel like you really need to review the entire chapter before you answer those questions, you can go ahead and do that. Otherwise, go ahead and answer your questions. When you're done with that whole page, probably chapter 14 and 15, I'll have your mom and dad snap a picture of it and email it to me so I can take a look at it. And we'll go from there. I'll see you next time for chapter 15. Bye, guys.